The alarms began before the stars finished bending, a twisting shimmer across the void that made every sensor on the Helios Vanguard convulse with static as Captain Arlen Voss stepped onto command deck, knowing instinctively that whatever was pushing through distortion was not friendly, not expected, and not something the fractured remnants of humanity could afford to face unprepared. Yet as the deck lights bled into a cold blue glow, and the crew stiffened with that ancient fear they had, inherited from centuries of exile, Arlen felt a deeper truth settling in his bones like a forgotten oath awakening, a silent confirmation that the galaxy had grown comfortable in their belief that humanity was dead, broken, scattered into myth, because the only survivors had vanished into the dark corridors of uncharted space decades ago, hiding wounds, building strength, learning to evolve in silence. And now, for the first time in 47 years, the Helios Vanguard had intercepted a signal that didn't belong to any known empire, a signal coded in a frequency pattern human engineers had once designed but abandoned long before the Great Collapse. And the moment Arlen saw the waveform twisting across the holodeck, he realized with tightening breath that it wasn't an enemy breach at all. It was a distress call, a desperate SOS encoded with Terran dialects no alien species could replicate. And the silence that followed its final pulse was heavier than gravity itself, suspending his thoughts as the crew stared at him, expecting orders, expecting answers, expecting him to explain how a human distress beacon could echo from a region of space supposedly controlled by the Dominion's extermination fleets. Because every record said there were no survivors there, no colonies left alive. And if any humans had remained hidden in those sectors, they would have been discovered and executed long ago. But Arlen knew better. He knew because he had once heard legends whispered in the lower decks by aging veterans who spoke of the ghost colonies, forgotten outposts where humanity had supposedly unlocked technologies the galaxy feared, places where the last brilliant minds had built engines capable of tearing through folded space-time and weapons forged from core-bound singularities. Impossibly advanced constructs rumored to be so devastating that the galactic councils had united temporarily just to ensure no human faction ever rebuilt what they destroyed. Yet the distress call proved something had survived, and as the Vanguard drifted closer to the source, Arlen felt the tension sharpening. The crew exchanging anxious glances because everyone aboard understood the danger getting involved. The Dominion's laws were absolute. Any vessel that trespassed into their controlled quarantine zones was considered hostile on sight, and even with the Vanguard's upgraded stealth plating, they were risking annihilation simply by approaching, but humanity had never been known for obeying the limits placed upon them. So Arlen steadied his voice and ordered a course correction toward the anomaly, watching as the deck's holographic starfield flickered, revealing a shattered planetoid drifting in the void like a corpse floating in a bloodless sea. Its crust cracked open as if something had detonated from within, releasing tendrils of molten metal that cooled into jagged ridges. And carved along its fractured surface were scorched symbols unmistakably human. Symbols etched with desperation, gouged into the rock itself as if the survivors had used whatever tools they had left to send a message that no one was supposed to ignore. And as the ship's floodlights swept across the broken terrain, the crew exhaled in stunned disbelief because the distress beacon wasn't just broadcasting from the planetoid. It was physically embedded into the granite core, a device older than the Vanguard itself, half fused into the stone and still humming with faint traces of Terran energy signatures not seen since the collapse. And beneath Arlen's steady composure, a storm churned because finding a relic like this was impossible, forbidden, a violation of the treaties forced upon humanity after their empire fell. And the Dominion would no doubt launch a cleansing fleet the moment they detected the signal's reactivation. But as the Vanguard drifted lower, approaching the breach in the surface, Arlen's eyes narrowed on something half buried in shadow, something reflective, angular, unmistakably engineered. And when the floodlight intensified, the crew gasped in unison because resting inside the crater was a vessel, a sleek obsidian craft unlike anything in modern design, shaped like a predator poised to strike, its hull carved within luminous veins that pulsed dimly like a heartbeat attempting to restart itself. And even though it was dormant, Its outline matched the forbidden schematics Arlen had once seen sealed in restricted archives files, documenting rumored experiments from the lost human warfront. Super vessels constructed for a final retaliation that never came. Ships known as Fury-class Phantoms. Prototypes said to be capable of turning entire fleets into drifting cinders if even a fragment of their systems powered on. But this one was shattered. Its engine core ruptured, its wings torn apart, and its main deck melted from extreme impact. Yet it still emitted faint power signatures, and Arlen found himself staring at a relic of humanity's forgotten fury, a weapon the galaxy believed had been completely eradicated. And as his pulse hammered his chest, the ship's AI announced an incoming transmission, an audio fragment captured directly from the crashed Phantom, a whispering, static-filled voice that stuttered between broken segments, repeating a single chilling phrase. "They're coming back, not for us, for all of you." And then the transmission dissolved into a scream that sounded both human and distorted, cutting off abruptly as if whoever recorded it had been torn away mid-sentence. And though the bridge fell silent, fear pooled in the air like thick smoke, because if this Phantom had been hunted down by something powerful enough to rip its hull apart, then whatever force destroyed it was something even the Dominion would fear, something that did not belong to any known empire, something hunting the last surviving fragments of human strength before humanity could rise again. And Arlen realized that by responding to this distress signal, he might have just triggered the same predator to notice them. Because a faint distortion shimmered on the edge of the nebula, a shadow not cast by any celestial body, a shift in the starfield like something uncloaking far larger than any Dominion warship. And as the crew scrambled to identify it, alarms shrieked, power flickered, and Arlen felt the Vanguard tremble under a gravitational ripple that was too perfectly timed to be natural, as though something in the void had been waiting for them to arrive. And now that they had, the stars themselves seemed to recoil, leaving Arlen with the sickening certainty that whatever hunted the ghost colonies had just turned its gaze toward the Vanguard and toward him. And as the distortion deepened into a colossal silhouette stretching across the darkness, he whispered under his breath that the galaxy had made a fatal mistake thinking humanity had vanished, because if their enemies were returning, then so, too would humanity's fury, and it would not arrive quietly. The moment the silhouette in the nebula solidified, the Helios Vanguard sensors collapsed under a tide of interference, so dense it felt like an invisible fist squeezing the ship's hull, and Captain Arlen Voss gripped the command rail as the deck vibrated with a deep subharmonic rumble that didn't sound like any engine or gravitational anomaly he had ever encountered, but rather something alive, something awakening, something that bent physics as if testing its own presence. And the crew scrambled across the console pits as their displays flickered between corrupted star maps and cascading error codes, none more terrifying than the one that repeated like a heartbeat. Unknown entity, unclassifiable, do not engage. And Arlen felt his pulse tighten, because their system's AI had only ever used that categorization once in recorded history. During the final days of the Great Collapse, when humanity's lost warfront encountered an enemy that didn't communicate, didn't negotiate, and didn't retreat, an enemy whose very existence had become a forbidden subject across surviving human factions, whisper labeled the Nullborn, a species or force or phenomenon no one had fully understood, but everyone had feared, something the Dominion secretly believed humanity had accidentally unleashed during its last era of technological extremism. And although the archives were fragmented, the rumor had always said that the Nullborn annihilated human strongholds not out of conquest, but out of some inscrutable cosmic purpose, cleansing anything that manipulated advanced space-time engines, hunting any civilization that tampered with singularity weaponry. And now, as the distortion deepened, revealing a vast lattice-like construct emerging from the nebula like an obsidian spider unfurling its limbs, Arlen realized with cold, sinking dread that this entity had tracked the distress signal just as the Vanguard had, and now it had found them both, human and survivor alike, as if drawn to the last flickers of Terran technology it sought to extinguish. But Arlen refused to allow paralysis to infect his bridge. barking orders to stabilize lateral thrusters and shift the Vanguard into a defensive drift, while Lieutenant Mara Thren struggled with the navigation arrays, her voice shaking as she tried to report that the distortion field was not merely visual, but actively rewriting the ship's inertia calculations, forcing the Vanguard to slide sideways through micro-folded pockets of warped vacuum that resisted traditional movement. And above them, the enormous construct continued descending with the slow precision of a predator savoring the moment before the kill, its surface covered in shifting hexagonal scales that rearranged themselves like a living machine, each movement accompanied by sparks of energy that crackled like distant thunder. And yet, despite its immense size, no known propulsion signature emitted from it. No heat signature. Nothing biological or mechanical. Enough to categorize. Simply a void-shaped intelligence carved into a vessel of impossible architecture. And when it projected a thin beam of pale violet light toward the crash phantom on the planetoid below, the beam spread across the wreck like a scanning veil, strips of metal peeling upward as if the craft itself were being disassembled down to its quantum lattice. And Arlen watched in horror as the Phantom's hull flaked apart into millions of glittering fragments before dissolving into a silent cloud of particles that drifted upward into the entity's latticework hull, absorbed without sound or energy discharge, leaving only a scar on a rock where the vessel had once rested, a memory erased from existence. And as the crew gasped in disbelief, Arlen felt the crushing weight of inevitability settle on his shoulders, because whatever this entity was, it had not come to hunt the survivors aboard the Phantom. It had come to cleanse every trace of that human technology before it could awaken, and the fact that the distress beacon had reactivated meant the entity would not leave until every last remnant was gone, including the Vanguard and its crew, because the beacon had transferred its last encrypted packet into the Vanguard's archives moments before the entity arrived, meaning they were now carriers of the very data the Nullborn sought to erase. And as Arlen opened the data file hoping for answers, the holodouble projected a rotating schematic that sent chills coursing down the crew's spine, because the distress beacon had not simply broadcast a cry for help. It had transmitted the incomplete blueprint of a weapon humanity had once designed in desperation, a weapon known only in fragmented whispers as the Helion Spire, a theoretical space-bending construct capable of collapsing an entire star system into an artificial singularity under controlled parameters, a retaliatory superweapon so catastrophic that the human high command had buried the project. Even before the collapse, fearing its activation might cascade uncontrollably through the galactic arms. But the survivors on the Ghost Colony had evidently discovered something, some truth about the Nullborn that made them believe only the Spire, or something derived from it, could stop what was coming, and Arlen stared at the incomplete blueprint as if it were a ghost speaking from across a gulf of extinct time, because the schematic was damaged, missing core equations, fractured like a mind, shaken by trauma, yet even half-finished and hummed with a kind of forbidden power. And the moment it appeared on the holodouble, the entity drifting above the planetoid shifted its orientation, its entire structure rotating toward the Vanguard with eerie synchronicity, as if it could sense the blueprint through the ship's hull, as if the presence of that knowledge alone were a threat that demanded annihilation. And before Arlen could lock down the data core, a thin strand of violet energy lanced outward from a massive lattice, slicing through vacuum like a silent blade, grazing the Vanguard shields and triggering a cascade of sparks across the interior walls as the shield matrix flickered dangerously low, leaving scorch marks on the exterior plating even though the beam hadn't made direct contact, and the crew stumbled as gravity fluctuated, alarm screaming while the entity adjusted for another strike. And in that breathless moment, Arlen understood the truth behind the distress. Call's final message: this thing was not coming for survivors. It was coming for galaxy itself, erasing any species capable of building what humanity once almost unleashed, and the Dominion, the Council, every empire that believed humans were extinct, all were equally unprepared for a threat that did not conquer worlds, but sterilized possibilities, eliminating potential before it evolved, erasing civilizations before they matured into something powerful enough to challenge the cosmic. balance the null-born enforced, and that meant the Vanguard's survival wasn't a matter of personal safety. It was the only line of continuity between humanity's past fury and its future resistance, the final chance to understand the threat and resurrect the technologies humanity once feared. Because Arlen saw now that the Ghost Colony survivors had not died in vain. They had triggered a chain reaction that forced the nullborn to reveal itself prematurely, and if even one human ship survived this encounter, the galaxy would finally learn what hunted them from the shadows of collapsed epochs. But first they had to escape, and as the violet beam grew brighter, Arlen clenched command rail and shouted for emergency ignition of the slipstream engines, even though the navigation officer protested that the distortion fields would tear the ship apart mid-jump. And Arlen met her terrified gaze with the grim resolve of a captain who carried the last unbroken thread of a species that refused extinction, whispering that the galaxy had underestimated humanity once. But they would not make that mistake again, and as the slipstream core roared to life, the lattice entity tilted like a predator coiling to strike, ready to erase them, ready to silence the last echo of the Ghost Colonies forever. The ship dropped out of fold space with a violent shudder that rattled every conduit in its frame, as if the universe itself objected to its arrival, and Captain Rios felt that strange electric pressure again, that invisible weight that warned him something terrible waited ahead, something ancient and patient and aware of them long before their sensors even registered the battlefield. And as the view cleared, the bridge fell silent. There were no wrecks, no derelicts, no burning debris arcs. Drifting in the dark, nothing at all to indicate the last human fleet had ever passed through this region. Yet the coordinates were exact, the timeline matched, and the beacon had pulsed them here with unmistakable Terran coding. But space was empty, unscarred, unnervingly clean, as if the battle had been erased atom by atom or swallowed whole by an impossible force. And Rios felt his heartbeat pound in his throat as Commander Vale murmured that this was wrong, deeply wrong, because the Altherian War doctrine dictated destruction, trophies, warnings carved into void so future species would know fear. But instead there was a silence so total it felt orchestrated, and the crew exchanged glances that carried the same unspoken dread, that maybe their return had been predicted. Maybe this emptiness was a message carved out of absence itself. Then the lights flickered, systems dipped, and the communications array flooded with static, so condensed it felt like a pressure wave, forcing its way inside the ship's skull, a single compressed burst of encrypted signals that should not have been active in a dead zone. And Rios demanded analysis, but before the tech teams could even begin, the lights died entirely and the ship went dark except for emergency strips glowing like thin red wounds along the walls, and the static cut abruptly, leaving behind a single sound, a faint metallic tapping echoing through every speaker, synchronized rhythmic, as if someone or something were knocking from outside the hull, and the crew froze as the taps formed a pattern, old Terran Morse, unmistakably human, impossibly precise, spelling out one chilling word: run. The temperature dropped, screens rebooted but displayed nothing except fractal distortions that resembled shifting eyes, watching, blinking, studying them, and Vale whispered that they were not alone, that something was inside the system architecture. Then Dr. Halden burst onto the bridge claiming that all biometric monitors in medbay had activated simultaneously, detecting multiple signatures, not crew, not Altherian, but something registering as human adjacent yet twisted by unknown modifications. And before Rios could issue containment protocols, the hull sensors activated with proximity alerts screaming across every panel, reporting massive spatial distortions forming all around them. Not ships, not crafts, but gravitational knots opening and closing like jaws in the void, and the tapping grew louder, more urgent, accelerating into a frantic warning that seemed to pulse through the very metal of the ship, and a new sound overrode it. A voice layered, distorted, as if spoken through 1,000 broken throats, whispering Rios's name with horrifying familiarity, and the crew stared at him in terror because the voice sounded human, painfully human, like someone who knew him, someone he had once served with, someone long dead. Then a silhouette materialized in the forward viewport. Not Outside but through it, a translucent figure flickering like corrupted holography. Its shape vaguely humanoid but wrong in proportions, stretched, broadened, armored with shifting plates of metallic bone. And its face, it was a face, glowed with cold awareness, and Rios felt a jolt of recognition so deep it made his stomach twist. Because despite the distortion, he knew this figure, knew the stance, the posture, the presence. Something buried deep in guilt he never voiced, and the thing leaned forward as if peering into the ship, mimicking breath though it needed none, and whispered again, this time with clarity that cut straight through him. You should not come back. Panic spread through the crew as Consol's spark and gravity lurched sideways, sending several officers sprawling. And the apparitions had jerked sharply as if listening to some distant command before its form began to fracture into shards of light drawn violently backward into a newly forming rift. Terror in space that pulsed with the color of the human I was never meant to see, and alarms blared as the ship was pulled toward it by an unseen force that squeezed the hull like a predator's grip, and the rift expanded, swirling, stretching, revealing a glimpse of something beyond. Dark structures moving with disturbing organic rhythm, colossal forms shifting as if waking. And in that moment Rios understood these were not Altherian constructs at all, but something older, something the Altherian themselves likely feared. And maybe this was why the fleet vanished, why no evidence remained, why the beacon called them here. The creature within the rift raised an arm, pointing directly at the bridge, and the ship's engines overloaded with a deafening roar, forcing Vale to slam emergency fold space ignition without clearance, and the ship lurched violently, pulled between escape thrust and the gravitational hunger of the rift, the hull groaning with the sound of metal begging for mercy, until in a blinding flash they were thrown into fold space once again, breaking free, tumbling through warp reality, alarms shrieking, lights failing, and as Rios hit the floor hard, vision swimming, he heard the last faint whisper echo through collapsing comm systems, a voice not human, not alien, but something between. You cannot run forever, Captain Rios. Not for what we made of them, not for what waits in the dark. And as the ship spiraled uncontrollably through the chaotic fold stream, a final message flickered onto main screen before it went dark entirely. Another Morse transmission, steady, cold, and filled with terrifying clarity. You are next. The ship tore out of fold space like a wounded animal, screaming through the void as if reality itself spat it back out. And for a long moment the crew lay scattered across the bridge, gasping, trembling, their minds still echoing with the impossible voices they had heard inside the fold stream. But Captain Rios forced himself upright despite the ringing in his skull, gripping the rail as the emergency light stabilized into a dim, blood-red gloom that made every face look haunted, and he demanded status reports even though he feared the answers, because the ship felt wrong, sick, like something had followed them through the jump, not physically but inside the circuitry. The air, their thoughts, and Commander Vale struggled to steady herself as she reported that the navigation core was blind, engine regulators were fried, long-range comms were dead, and the ship was drifting in an uncharted region where even the starfield looked unfamiliar, too sparse, too dim, as if they were on the ragged edge of the galaxy where starlight itself hesitated to shine, and Rios felt that same crawling instinct along his spine that had first warned him at the empty battlefield, an instinct whispering that they had not escaped anything. They had been delivered, placed exactly where the pursuers wanted them. Then Dr. Halden arrived from medbay with a shaken expression that made Rios's dread deepen, because Halden was never rattled. Yet now he reported that the strange biometrics detected earlier were still active, still reading as faint, fluctuating signatures moving within the lower decks, flitting between walls and bulkheads, as if ignoring physical space. And the worst part was that the readings remained stubbornly human-adjacent, close enough to cause nausea in anyone who looked directly at the data, like staring at a twisted reflection. And Rios ordered a tactical sweep despite knowing deep down that no normal search team could handle whatever these things were. As squads deployed, the ship groaned again, not from damage, but from something pressing against it, brushing along its hull in slow, deliberate passes, as if sampling the material, testing it, and a cold shiver swept through the bridge when external mics picked up faint scrapes and clicking sounds that resembled insect limbs gliding across metal, and Vale whispered that they should cut power to make the ship appear dead. But Rios refused, because instinct told him the creatures already knew exactly where they were. Meanwhile, in the lower decks, the squads began reporting strange visual distortions, flickers of movement along the corner of their helmet cams, whispering static that grew louder the deeper they went, until one squad found something that froze every person watching the feed. A smear across the wall, not blood, but a slick metallic residue that pulsed faintly as if alive, and embedded in it was a human dog tag, scorched, bent, etched with name Rios recognized. Instantly, Lieutenant Cade Mercer, a friend he had lost during the last known battle of the Old Fleet, a battle no survivors reported seeing bodies taken, just soldiers disappearing mid-combat like ghosts ripped from the battlefield, and Rios felt his breath leave him as one squad member remarked that the residue looked like the aftermath of an assimilation process, some horrific merging of organic and inorganic matter, and before they could analyze further, the residue began to vibrate, rising from a wall like black mercury, shifting into a vaguely humanoid shape before dissolving into mist that streamed into the vents within human speed, cutting the squad's feed into static. Rios knew then, with a terrible certainty, that whatever had taken the Old Fleet did not kill them. It transformed them, repurposed them, forged them into something unrecognizable, and now those things were inside his ship. Alarms blared suddenly as the gravitational field around them fluctuated wildly. Sensors, struggling to map something massive forming in the dark behind them, and the crew stared in mute horror as the view screen flickered back to life, showing a vast silhouette emerging from the void, bigger than any Altherian dreadnought, shaped like a cathedral of living metal, spires shifting, tendrils unfurling like colossal sensory limbs, and at its center burned a single eye-like aperture, pulsing like a heartbeat. Watching them with a hunger that felt ancient and personal, Vale staggered back, whispering that this was not Altherian tech. This was something the Altherian had probably fled from, something that hunted not just species but entire civilizations, digesting them into its growing mass, a predator older than recorded time. And Rios realized with sickening clarity that humanity had not been underestimated by the galaxy. They had been marked, selected, deemed worthy not for destruction but for harvesting. The rift entity they had seen earlier had been only an emissary, a broken echo of a human soldier consumed by the construct, repurposed to lure them deeper into its territory. And as the colossal structure drifted closer, the ship's lights dimmed again, energy siphoned away by invisible tendrils, and the voices returned to the comms, overlapping whispers crying out in agony, in anger, in pleading fragments of humanity trapped within the monstrous architecture. And Rios felt something inside him break as he recognized more voices, faces of people he once commanded, friends thought lost, now bound into a collective consciousness of suffering. Then the ship jolted violently as a boarding breach formed, not through the hull but through space itself, a pocket of warp reality opening inside the cargo bay, spilling forth silhouettes of fused armor and sinew, once humans with flickering eyes and metallic growths crawling across their skin like parasites guiding their movements. And internal lights flickered as they advanced, silent except for faint whispers leaking from their throats, calling Rios's name, begging for release they no longer understood. Panic rippled to the crew as internal defenses failed, and Vale turned to Rios with trembling resolve, saying they needed to make a choice now, escape or die. But Rios knew escape was illusion, because the construct behind them had locked onto their ship like prey, and as the monstrosity's eye aperture widened, preparing to latch onto them with a gravitational tether strong, enough to tear continents apart, Rios made a decision born of desperation and fury. He ordered a manual override on the ship's volatile prototype core, triggering a charge that could destabilize fold space itself if detonated nearby, a suicidal move that might destroy them all but might also tear a hole in the construct's feeding mechanism long enough to break free. The crew stared at him in shock as red warnings flooded the screens, and the boarding creatures paused, turning their heads in. unnatural unison as if sensing the shift, and for the first time their whispering merged into a single voice, deep and resonant, speaking through them with chilling finality. You cannot unmake what has already begun, Captain Rios. You are part of the return, and humanity will rise through us, not against us. But Rios met their hollow gaze with defiant glare, and as he slammed his palm onto the final authorization panel, the entire ship trembled like a held breath, energy building to catastrophic levels, and the construct outside accelerated toward them with terrifying speed, as if realizing their intent, its entire surface rippling with panic or hunger. It was impossible to tell which, and Rios shouted for everyone to brace themselves, because whatever happened next would determine the fate of humanity itself. And just as the reactor reached critical threshold, just before the universe seemed ready to split open around them, everything went white. The universe returned in pieces, shattered sound, fractured light, fragments of memory drifting like dust. And for a horrifying moment, Captain Rios could not tell if he was alive, dead, or suspended somewhere between those two finalities. But then his senses began to stitch together, and he felt the groaning weight of a cracked harness across his chest, the stale metallic tang of burned ozone in the air, and the cold realization that the ship had somehow endured the blast, though barely, because the bridge around him looked like the skeleton of a once-living creature, walls warped inward, consoles melted into grotesque shapes, and the emergency lighting flickered with a dying heartbeat rhythm that bathed everything in a sickly amber haze. Rios fought to stand, legs trembling, head pounding with aftershock static. And as he looked around, he saw Vale lying unconscious but breathing. Halden slumped over his terminal with blood matting his hair, and several crew members pinned under. Collapsed support beams, groaning softly. But the strangest thing was the silence. The absence of the monstrous whispers, the psychic scraping, the distant voices of lost soldiers that had haunted them since the fold stream rupture, as if the blast had severed not just physical links, but some deeper tether that connected the constructs collective to their minds. For a fleeting moment, Rios felt hope, real hope, but it evaporated instantly when the view screen flickered on, glitching through. Static, until revealed the horrifying truth that made his blood run cold. The construct was still there, farther away now, drifting like a wounded titan, its living metal cathedral form fractured with glowing fissures spreading like spiderwebs across its hull, but its central eye aperture still burned with furious, pulsing light, and Rios understood that while they had hurt it, they had not killed it, and worse, the thing was now tethered to them not by gravity, but by something stronger. Intention. Vale regained consciousness with a sharp gasp, her eyes wide with terror as she felt the psychic pressure return, weaker but sharper, like claws dragging across her thoughts, and she croaked out that she could still hear them, distant, screaming, multiplied, as if their attack had unleashed the trapped souls within the construct interior, and Rios felt the deck vibrate beneath his boots as the ship's course struggled to stabilize, fragile and flickering, dangerously close to A, cascading failure if pushed further. Meanwhile, Halden, despite the blood on his temple, forced himself upright and stumbled his console, scanning their surroundings, and his face paled as he reported something impossible. They were no longer in any known region of the galaxy, no longer within mapped territory or recorded space, because the starfield outside the viewport was utterly alien, dominated by a colossal swirling nebula of bluish-green gas that pulsed like a living organism, and drifting around its edges were countless structures resembling construct, smaller but similar in design, like a cluster of gestating predators waiting to awaken, and Rios felt his stomach twist as he realized the truth. What they had encountered was not a singular entity, but one fragment of an entire ecosystem, a vast machine organism collective and visible to the civilizations of the galaxy, because it operated in regions of space that defied normal physics. One creature had been enough to wipe out humanity's first fleet. Yet here dozens or hundreds slumbered, dormant, waiting, feeding, learning, and the one they had damaged was calling to them across the void like a wounded alpha, summoning its pack. Panic surged through the crew as Halden confirmed faint movement among the other constructs. Slow but unmistakable, shapes peeling away from a nebula's edge, drifting toward them like massive predatory shadows drawn by the scent of prey, and Vale whispered that they had delivered themselves straight into the heart of the enemy's domain, a place no species was ever meant to see. And Rios knew she was right. This was the feeding ground, the crucible in which civilizations were consumed, repurposed, reborn. The ship groaned again as the damaged entity outside extended a tendril of warped matter, reaching, searching, and the faint echoes of human voices began to bleed into the comms, fragmented, agonized, pleading to be freed from the construct's hive mind. And Rios felt. Tears burned his eyes because he recognized some of those voices. Friends from the academy, officers he lost in battles that never made sense, soldiers reported missing, their fates explained away as wartime chaos when the truth was that they had been taken. Vale clung to the railing, shaking, whispering that they could not let themselves be absorbed, that humanity must not become part of whatever horrifying evolution the construct intended, and Rios forced himself to think, to strategize, despite the crushing despair tightening around his mind, and he knew that escape through normal means was impossible, communications unreachable, engines fried, fold space navigation blinded. But then Halden, voice trembling yet determined, pointed to the core readouts, showing the same unstable energy buildup that saved them earlier, and he explained that while the core could not open a stable fold space route, it could theoretically tear open a raw fissure, dangerous, unpredictable, potentially lethal, but perhaps capable of flinging them far enough away to evade the construct's reach, a desperate gamble with no guarantee except that staying meant certain assimilation. Vale protested that a raw fissure could scatter them across time, space, or annihilate them entirely, but Rios interrupted her with quiet resolve, saying that humanity had always survived by choosing an impossible path rather than surrendering to the inevitable, and if their story ended here, it would end on their terms, not inside a cosmic predator's stomach. Alarms blared suddenly as the damaged construct surged forward, accelerating far faster than expected given its injuries, tendrils unfurling into a vast maw-like aperture that glowed with brilliant, consuming light, and the psychic voices rose into a deafening chorus of torment and command, urging the crew to submit, to join, to return. Rios slammed his hand onto the core override once more, inputting Halden's coordinates, a sequence that was not a destination but a direction, somewhere, anywhere away. And the ship trembled violently as the unstable fissure generator began to ignite, space folding on itself like wet paper around them, the view screen warping into twisted spirals of color and darkness that made the crew nauseous to look at. The construct drew closer, its aperture widening into a massive vortex of hungry light, and the psychic voices crescendoed into a unified scream that shook the marrow of every human on board. And just as a tendril reached the hull, curling around the ship like a serpent ready to crush its prey, Rio shouted for everyone to hold on. Then the raw fissure detonated, opening into a swirling tier of impossible geometry, pulling the ship forward with catastrophic force, the hull groaning like it was being ripped apart, consoles exploding in showers of sparks, crew members screaming as gravity reversed and folded and vanished. Behind them, the construct bellowed through minds rather than sound. An enraged god denied its meal, and its tendril snapped in half as the ship was swallowed by the fissure, leaving behind a shockwave that rippled to the nebula, momentarily halting the movement of the other constructs. And then everything went dark, utterly dark, a void beyond absence, and Rios felt himself falling not through space, but through memory, through identity, through the thin threads of what it meant to be human, until finally, after what felt like eternity, a point of light appeared, distant but growing, and the ship burst out of the fissure with a violent lurch, alarms screaming, sparks flying, gravity slamming them back into the physical realm. When the light cleared and the system stabilized enough to show a fragmentary view, Rio stared in astonishment at the familiar star patterns, recognizable, mapped, tracing countless navigation charts. They were home, not at Earth exactly, but in the outskirts of human territory, a region they could navigate, a region with allies, a region with hope, Vale burst into relieved laughter mixed with sobs. Halden slumped in exhaustion, and the surviving crew let out choked cries of triumph and grief. But Rios's gaze hardened as he stared at the faint scar in space closing behind him, the last trace of the fissure dissipating. And he whispered that the constructs knew now the galaxy would not stay ignorant forever, and humanity had one truth left to face. The enemy had always been watching, always feeding. And soon the galaxy would realize that the things lurking beyond map space were stirring, awakening, coming. And as the ship drifted toward the nearest human relay station, battered but alive, Rios vowed that the next time humanity returned to that forbidden region, they would not return as prey. They would return with fury.